All right, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to our Adult Education February Spirituality Series for 2022, sponsored by our Adult Education Committee. The series is called Kabbalah Made Simple, How to Understand Jewish Mysticism and Apply It to Your Life. Now, this is a challenge to study Kabbalah, this esoteric Jewish mystical tradition. First of all, to understand it, that's challenge number one. Challenge number two is to apply it to our lives. But I am convinced we're going to be able to do both things. We're going to be able to understand it. We're going to be able to apply it to our lives. We've got the help of some great Jewish teachers, modern day teachers that I will be mentioning time and again, and you'll see their names listed on the handout that you've received or that's been emailed to you. And I think with them as guides and other teachers that I've read over the years, we can understand Kabbalah and we can apply it to our lives. Those are our two goals. So I want to welcome you all for being here. How many people, just show of hands, have studied Kabbalah before? Okay, so if you have, how many people have not studied it before? Okay, and a number of people haven't done it. Okay, all right, very nice. So we're all learning together. Those of you who may be more proficient and those of you who are starting out, we're going to talk about this in ways that each one of us can understand it and apply it to our lives. Let me begin by asking you all a question. When you, because Kabbalah, well, let's start with the term. Kabbalah, the word itself is a Hebrew word, Kabbalah, that's sort of the anglicized way of doing it. It's an ancient Jewish word that means receiving or tradition. When I pass Torah to a B'nai Mitzvah, I tell each and every bar and bat mitzvah student or B'nai Mitzvah student, you are now part of the Shashelet HaKabbalah, the chain of Jewish tradition. Shashelet is a chain, HaKabbalah is the tradition. So Kabbalah means tradition, but at its root, it means to receive. So what is being received in the Jewish mystical tradition is the tradition itself, the teachings of the tradition, and also the idea of receiving this esoteric wisdom, being receptive, being open to the divine in our lives in new ways, in deeper ways. So I think it has both of those senses, Kabbalah. It's a received tradition. These teachings were passed down from teacher to disciple for generations. Then they were written in books. And even after they were written in books, they were passed down from teacher to disciple. They were studied together as most Jewish study is done in Chavruta, is with a partner, with somebody else to understand it, to really understand it. So it has that sense of receiving the sacred text, the tradition, but also has this spiritual sense of being open and receptive to wisdom, to God's presence. And so that's Kabbalah. Now let's talk about mysticism for a second. When you hear the word mysticism, what do you think of? What comes to your mind? If we could maybe put this in the chat box, for those of you who are proficient with the chat box, let's use the chat box, open up our chat box and give you a second. When you think of mysticism, what do you think of? Hidden meanings. Yes, sort of this hidden meaning, hidden knowledge, esoteric, secret knowledge. And it was sort of secret, passed down from teacher to disciple. Finding deeper meaning, right? This sense of depth, this sense of profundity, going down layers, mysticism. Things that cannot be easily explained. Yes. Another level of consciousness. Yes. Tapping into another level of consciousness. A mystic is tapping another level of consciousness. Very nice. Unity with the divine. Yes, unity with the divine. I like seeing that word. Secret, not allowed to study as a woman. Well, this is true. In Kabbalah, traditionally, men studied. They had to be 40 years of age. They had to be married. They had to know Torah and Talmud before they can even approach this hidden, esoteric, secret, mystical knowledge. Now, thank God we're living in an age where there are women Kabbalists and, women authors of Kabbalah and studying and learning and teaching. So thank you. I want to also, this idea of unity with the divine, that word unity, let's underscore that word throughout these 3 sessions together, because ultimately what we're looking at, and when I think of somebody who's a mystic, I think of someone who maybe has a direct experience of the divine. So when I think of a mystic, they have, experiential knowledge of God and the divine, in addition to having, teachings and learned, sort of academic knowledge, but also a direct experiential knowledge of it. And this sense of seeing the connections between God and God's world. And we're going to see as we go through Kabbalah and we talk more about God in these next 3 classes together, that the whole world, according to the Kabbalists, is God or is in God. So when we're talking about direct experience of the divine or God, we're also talking about a deep and direct experience of life itself. Because Kabbalah in some ways is a map. When we look at the Sphero, those diagrams that we're going to look at in just a moment, it is a map of God's personality. It is God's attributes. It is human attributes created B'Tselem Elohim in God's image. And we're looking at godly attributes. We're looking at human attributes. And we're looking at how God interacts with the world itself, how God created the world, and how God interacts with God's creation. It's all there. So when we think of Jewish mysticism, particularly we think of Kabbalah, we're thinking of that unity, that direct experience, that interconnectedness, that deepening of knowledge of life and the divine and the mind of God. It's quite powerful. So on one level, I just want to briefly walk through the history of Jewish mysticism, because Jewish mysticism didn't start with Kabbalah. In some ways, Kabbalah is the term for the Jewish mystical tradition, but it also is a specific term to a sort of a layer of Jewish mystical tradition that began in the 12th and 13th century. First in France and then in Spain. That's where Kabbalah really was created. 12th century France and Provence, and 13th century Spain in Castile and Catalonia. I say those names as if I know what they mean. I mean, I've looked at Google Maps and I can tell you those regions of Spain. Has anybody been to Spain and been to Castile or Catalonia, those areas? And if so, please type it. Yeah, a number of people. Okay. So that's where in the 13th century, Kabbalah really took off. But prior to that, if we talk about a direct experience of God, give me an example of a direct experience of God in Judaism pre-12th or 13th century. Would somebody like to put it in the chat box? Moses, burning bush. Moses at the burning bush. And by the way, Moses says to God, God, tell me your name. When you want me to go back and try to free these slaves, they're going to ask what your name is. What is your name? Meaning, if I can tell them a name that will tell me something about your essence. And God says, Ehiyeh Asher Ehiyeh. I am that I am. I will be who I will be. And one of the best books, I think, one of my favorite books on Kabbalah today to really understand it and apply it, is this book right here called Ehiyeh, A Kabbalah for Tomorrow by Arthur Green. Professor Arthur Green is a teacher of Reconstructionists, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox Jews, in the modern era. He's written a number of books. He's one of the primary, I think today, one of the greatest scholars of Kabbalah living in America today, Rabbi Art Green, Professor Art Green, taught at University of Pennsylvania, taught at Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, Brandeis. His book, Ehyeh, A Kabbalah for Tomorrow, I'm going to quote from it today, outstanding. So Ehyeh, Asher Ehyeh. Ehyeh's name we're going to see for one of the Kabbalistic names of God, and comes straight from the Torah, straight from the revelation at the burning bush. Ezekiel and the chariot. Yes, Jacob wrestling with the angel. The prophets, all of them had direct experiences of the divine, and they wrote about them. Ezekiel's was one of the most powerful visions of the divine, a chariot. If you read Ezekiel, my goodness, you think Ezekiel lived in 1960s San Francisco and was hanging out in Haight-Ashbury and was having chemically induced experiences. When you read Ezekiel, it's just like that. Well, Ezekiel's vision during the time of the Talmud was a primary path to Jewish mysticism, to meditate on Ezekiel's chariot, to mention names of God, contemplate names of God, and have the vision that Ezekiel had. That was a major form of Jewish mysticism during the Talmud. Another major form of Jewish mysticism was something called Ma'aseh Bereshit, the workings of creation, how God created the world. One of the first pre-Kabbalistic texts is called Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation. Sefer Yetzirah, like Yotzer Or, the prayer for forming light that we say on Shabbat morning. Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, was apparently composed in the land of Israel between the 3rd and the 6th centuries. In Sefer Yetzirah, it says God created the world with the 22 letters, Hebrew letters, and 10 Sphirot. I'm going to put that word in the chat box. Yeah, Merkavah means chariot. Merkavah means chariot in Hebrew. So Sphero, this is the major symbol system of Kabbalah, of the Jewish mystical tradition. And it begins with Sefer Yetzirah in the 3rd to 6th century. We know the term like a Sefer Torah, a book of the Torah, same root. Sifra also means number. Mispar means number. So the idea in early Jewish mysticism that Kabbalah really ran with in the 12th and 13th centuries, that God created the world through numbers. And those numbers are then going to be developed to entities, to powers, to emanations from God. But there are 10 Sphirot, and the word Sphirot literally means numbers. And the Sphirot is the central symbol system of Kabbalah, and that's why we're going to focus the next hour on the Sphirot, and that's what you have in your handout. You've got 3 different diagrams of the Sphirot. So from Sefer Yetzirah in the 3rd to 6th century, the first Kabbalistic book, considered the first authentic Kabbalistic book in Provence, France, is called Sefer HaBahir. Bahir means bright or clear, the book of brightness, the book of clarity. And in Sefer HaBahir from 12th century France, the Sphirot, these numbers that God used, these powers, these entities that God used to create the world with the 22 letters, they continue to be powers, lights, attributes of God, God's self. They represent stages of God's inner life, aspects of God's personality. The Sphirot are aspects of God's personality They are attributes of God, and they are human attributes as well, because we are created in God's image. And that's why the Sphero are so important. It's God's attributes, it's our godly, divine attributes created in God's image, and it's what God used, powers, potencies, emanations to create the universe. And then just 100 years later, moving over from France into Spain, you have in Castile, a book appears in about 1280 called Sefer HaZohar, the Zohar, the Book of Radiance. And the Book of Radiance is about a 1,000-page book. And it is the Bible of Kabbalah, the Bible of Jewish mysticism to this day. 1280 in Spain. And it has been suggested, and I'm going to give you another name now, and I'll show you the book, my other go-to book, my other go-to scholar. Oh, you can barely see this, but it's called The Essential Kabbalah. You've got it. I've listed it under the diagram. I give you the name of both Art Green, and I give you the name of Daniel Matt. Daniel Matt has translated the Zohar into English, all 1,000 or so pages, into several volumes. It took him like 12 or 13 years. And he also does commentary on every word, every line, like a commentary of Talmud or a commentary of Torah. Daniel Matt, probably the preeminent American scholar today on Kabbalah. He's got a number of books. The Essential Kabbalah, The Heart of Jewish Mysticism, is one of his best. But if you really want to go deep, you can get his 6-8 volume version of the Zohar translated with commentary. Probably cost you several $100s. It's not cheap. But you can get it on Kindle. You can get a lot of this stuff on Kindle. It's a little bit cheaper. And you can carry it with you. What would the Kabbalists say to be carrying the Zohar and the Sphero with you and on your phone? What would they think? Are you with me so far? Any questions so far? That was the history, brief history. Does that sound good? Yeah, Harley, if you want to unmute.
You mentioned numbers, and where do the numbers fall in? What was the practicality of numbers?
Good question. And Daniel Matt talks, by the way, in his book, Kabbalah, The Heart of Jewish Mysticism, about this. He's got a great introduction to Kabbalah at the beginning, and then there are various texts, Kabbalistic texts that he translates and comments on. By the way, and what I was getting to with Daniel Matt, the Zohar, he calls it sort of like a, first of all, it's a commentary, it's a mystical commentary on the Torah based on weekly Torah portions, but he also calls it a mystical novel. It's sort of a mystical novel. It's got characters, these rabbinical characters of the 2nd century who traveled the Galilee and the land of Israel, commentating on verses of Torah and biblical characters, giving their mystical interpretations, going deep into the text, and also having visions and mystical events that happen to them. So he refers to it as a mystical novel, as well as a commentary, a mystical commentary on the Torah. So where do numbers come from? According to Daniel Matt and people like Arthur Green, Pythagorean mysticism. So if this is coming out of, say, the first, 600-700 years of the Common Era, numbers were a part of mystical traditions in the Middle East and in Greek thought, that numbers are the basis for reality, that numbers structure the physical world, mathematical principles, right? And if you think about it today, I mean, who are our modern day folks who are telling us how the world was created? It's scientists who know numbers, who know math. They are the ones explaining the Big Bang. By the way, Daniel Matt has a wonderful book called, I think, God and the Big Bang, where he explores the creation of the world according to scientists today based on Jewish Kabbalistic mystical principles and said they're talking the same language. It's remarkable. If you're into sort of science and cosmology and things like that, check out God and the Big Bang by Daniel Matt. It's fantastic. And we're going to look today, we're going to see some Big Bang type language as we look at the Sphero. So I think that's where the numbers come from. I think this was part of the ancient world, that numbers were powers that structured the universe. Yeah. Gematria. Yeah, Paul. Thank you, Paul. Good to see you. Paul Gainan is right, saying gematria. And it's a Greek term using numbers to find meaning in texts, in Hebrew words, in Jewish texts, and making associations, mystical associations. Yeah, gematria. Very good. Yeah, and remember too, every Hebrew letter also has a numerical value in Judaism. So you could use the Hebrew words, put them into their numerical equivalent, and you get, for example, that the Hebrew word ahava, which means love, equals 13 if you add up the letters for ahava, and the word echad, oneness, unity, God is echad, is one, also 13. So love and God's unity are connected through gematria and through the Jewish mystical tradition, and we're going to see how that works in the Sphero. So without further ado, let's take a look at the Sphero. So if you'll bear with me, do I need to share my screen, or are we good? Does everybody have the handout?
No, we don't have it.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen then. I am going to share my screen, and hopefully you all can see. Can you all see that tree there?
Perfect. Yes.
All right, let me quickly explain the tree. And you can see these circles inside the tree, these colored circles. So the Sphirot is this central symbol of God's personality, human personality, and how God used the powers of the 10 Sphirot. There are 10, like 10 commandments, like with 10 sayings, God created the world. The Talmud says with 10 sayings, where it says, and God said, let there be light, and God said, let this happen, 10 sayings. So we know 10 is a significant number in Judaism. There are 10 Sphirot, and they are sometimes depicted as a part of a human body, and they are sometimes depicted as a tree of life, an Eitz Chaim, with inverted, so that the roots are in heaven and the branches are down here on earth. So keep that in mind as we now look at, dun, 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 dun. There they are. You are looking at the personality of God according to the Kabbalists. We're looking at the personality of God depicted, and again, by the great Professor Daniel Matt. Here are the 10 Sphirot with Hebrew names and with descriptions, and we're going to look at each one. Forgive me if you're putting something in the chat box. I can't see it because I've shared my screen. So maybe I'll invite people, if you would, to call out if you have. Is there a way for me to do this? How can I do this? Wait, I have an idea. How can I share my screen and also see the chat box? Does anybody know? Okay. All right, let's try this. If somebody will type something in the chat box, I want to see if it pops up on my screen. Can somebody just say hi or shalom? Oh, I did see something come up in the chat. Oh, look at that. I have my chat box as a separate window now. Can you guys see my chat box?
Yes.
You can see my chat box?
Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, it's floating here next to the Sphero. All right, great, perfect. I love it. Now I can't see everybody. So again, if you want to make a comment or have a question, please, if you'll just unmute and call out or put it in the chat box. I can definitely see the chat box, but I cannot see everybody. So here are the 10 Sphirot. It's very linear. One thing leads to another, one Sphera, one, and by the way, another way to think of the Sphirot are emanations. These are emanations from God, within God, and also sort of to the creation of the world. And this is going to make sense after I explain it. So let's talk about why Sphero, why these emanations, why these 10 attributes and these 10 emanations from God. The Kabbalists recognize, as does Maimonides, the great rational thinker Maimonides in the 12th century, that God ultimately is unknowable, that God is infinite. As the Kabbalists say, God is Ein Sof, without end, limitless, infinite, that God is Ein Sof. And that term Ein Sof is used again and again in Zohar and in Jewish mysticism. So, but how does an infinite God make room and create a physical universe? It's as if God needs to almost materialize in a way to create a physical world. If God is beyond the physical, if God is infinite and boundless, God is ultimately beyond the physical. How does a non-physical God create a physical world? And what the Kabbalists created was this idea that God emanated from Ein Sof, from the infinite, from the endless, to these various specific attributes. And through these attributes was able to create the physical world and the human soul and everything in the world. So you've got Ein Sof sort of above these 10 Sphero. Ein Sof is not a Sphera, but the first Sphera that God creates is close to Ein Sof. So if you look at the top, and if you can see me circling here, the first Sphera is called Keter. Keter is the Hebrew word for crown. It also means circle. So sometimes the Sphirot are depicted as circles, or all 10 Sphirot are, 10 circles within a big circle. So Keter means crown, and you'll see in Daniel Matz, let's start with Daniel Matz because this makes the most sense. If you look at Daniel Matz, under the word crown, to the right of the word Keter, and by the way, you can see it sort of, it looks like a flow, like a spotlight into Keter, and again, the idea is Ein Sof now is pouring light. There's a lot of nature imagery in the Zohar, right? It's set in Israel. So, our people are very nature oriented, biblically, Talmudically, living in the land, and also the Kabbalah is very down-to-earth, nature-oriented while it's talking about esoteric things. So this is like an emanation of light. It's an emanation of water. It's a flow. So think of those images. So you've got the flow from Ein Sof into the endless, into Keter. Now Keter has a sense of will to it, that all God is doing at this point is willing existence. It's just an act of will. And another word for Keter, this highest level, this is the highest level, and then it goes progressively lower. Another name for crown is Ein, literally nothingness, Ein. Almost like Ein Sof, no end. Ein Sof, no end. So another way to think of Keter is nothingness. Now here's how Daniel Matt explains that. Another way to understand nothingness is no thingness. So at this point, God, the infinite, is creating a way for God to interact with the world. And the first act is just an act of will. And this is undifferentiated being, no thingness, pure potential. Think of Keter as pure potential, no boundary, almost, boundless, like Ein Sof. That's why I say Keter's close to Ein Sof, but not Ein Sof. So you've got this sort of no thingness, pure potential, unbounded, and it's just an act of will to create. And then from Keter, you move to the right. We're going to move. So we're moving. We're going to go from Keter. I'll use my mouse. We're going to go this way to right, to left, to down to the center, to right, to left, to down to the center, to right, to left, to down to the center, to the center. So you've got these polarities of God's attributes and the way God operates in the world. And these polarities are like yin and yang in Eastern Chinese thought. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start. Keter so God has a desire, an act of will to start creating. And then the first thing that's created is Chokhmah. Chokhmah, you may have heard that Hebrew term, it means wisdom. A chacham is a wise person. Chokhmah, a great word, wisdom. Now notice what Daniel Matt then puts underneath the word wisdom, point. Chokhmah is a point. So from an act of will, undifferentiated being, God creates a point. And for those of you who know science, if I know my Big Bang Theory somewhat well, don't they say the Big Bang begins with this point, this tiny, tiny little point, smaller than a fingernail, that includes inside of it all of the potential for a created universe. And that's the Big Bang. It just expands from a tiny, tiny point. Well, that's what Kabbalah says that God did. That God created, formed a point, and from this point, this beginning, you go to the left now. That point then goes into Binah, which literally means understanding in Hebrew, but the way it's understood, the way it's described in thank you, Jim. So infinitely small, dense point. That's a great way to think of it. Big Bang, Kabbalah too. An infinitely small, dense point that contains the potential for everything. And then it goes into Binah, which means understanding, but it also means palace or womb. Now, this is key in Zohar. The main imagery and metaphor in Zohar is sexual. This is very HBO in some ways. But if you think about it, right, people for thousands of years, when we talk about creation of the world, we use the word procreation, right? Those words are linked. Creation and procreation are linked. So it makes sense that the Kabbalists, like other mystics, they look at the creation of life, of human life or animal life, that involves the sexual act to reproduce and create life. This is also the main imagery in Kabbalah. So think of Chokhmah now as a seed, as male seed that is able to impregnate Binah and the womb of Binah. Right. As you're saying, Marie, that's our point of reference, right? So you've got the seed that impregnates Binah in the womb, and from there, everything can be created. And sometimes Chokhmah is referred to in Zohar and Kabbalah as, as Abba, as father, the primary Abba, and Binah is the primary Ima, the primary mother. And from the male Chokhmah and the female Binah, you're going to get everything else to come out of it. Everything's going to be created in Binah. And the first thing that is created, we're going to go to the right again, is chesed, that great Hebrew word, gimilut chasadim, right? That acts of loving kindness are the foundation of the world. So the first creative act, and by the way, this is within God. This is not yet in the natural world. The natural world is down here at the bottom, Shekhinah. Everything's going to flow into Shekhinah. which is going to be part of the natural world too. So this is all within God right now. So Chokhmah and Bina as the primary, the divine mother and father of God, within God, are going to create their first child is Chesed, loving kindness. So when we, when other traditions say God is love, we say that in Judaism too. God is love. The first thing that Chokhmah and Bina create together is love, Chesed, love or grace, an infinite love, a boundless source of blessing and goodness and generosity and giving. So that's Chesed. Now you'll notice too in Daniel Matt's description, another word for, obviously, for love is grace. This is God's graciousness, beneficence, goodness. These now we get below Chokhmah and Bina, the next 7 Sphero. So we got the top 3, Keter, Chokhmah, and Bina. They create this triad that is sort of very esoteric, hard to understand, hard to even contemplate, meditate on. We've got the outlines of understanding it. But once we start getting into Chesed to the left and then on down, now we're talking about attributes that are easily understandable. These are God's attributes that are easy to see, easy to understand, human attributes that are easy to see, easy to understand. So they're represented by qualities. They're also represented by colors. White is the color of Chesed, and then it says right arm. So this Sphero are represented as a tree of life and its Chaim, but they're also represented as a human body. So what you're looking at here is the body of God. This is a radical ideas. The Kabbalists are radical in their imagery. They're radical in their ideas. Some Kabbalists said, hey, we sometimes say in the Christian world, they made God into 3. We made God into 10. There are 10 powers, divine attributes here that are being talked about. But there are also human attributes. So when we're looking at this, we're looking at God. We're also looking at the first human being, Adam, and every human being that came after Adam. So you're looking at a human being from the back. So if you want to think about it, picture Keter, Chokhmah, and Bina like being the head, or maybe even above a human head. And then you've got Chesed being a right arm. The right arm of God, so to speak, and also Chesed sort of being, spiritually on this right side, the strength of a right arm. That's the strength of Chesed, the power of love. Yeah. Any questions so far or comments so far? Okay, so love is expansive. Love is generous. It's just like an outpouring. It's this flow. It's this endless flow of love of God. But love needs to be tempered. You can't just have an endless flow of love. And we're going to talk about how this relates to human beings in a second. Chesed needs to be balanced on the left by Givurah. Givurah, Gibor, means power. A Gibor is a hero. The word Gibor means hero. But Givurah, we say the Givurot, right? In the Amidah prayer, we say the Givurot prayer. We talk about God's power. So this is God's power. It also sometimes Givurah is called Din, which means judgment. Rosh Hashanah, Yom HaDin, the day of judgment. justice. The word rigor is used. So if chesed is white, the givurah is red. We're going to talk about what red means in a second. Left arm, right arm, balanced by the left arm. So think of this as restraint. Givurah is restraining God's love. It is setting boundaries to God's love. It's putting limits on God's love, that it needs to be balanced. That if you have this never-ending flow of love, that's going to get the world out of balance. And I'm going to stop my share for a second, just so we can see each other, and I want us to be able to talk about this. That love needs to be balanced by judgment, by restraint, by rigor, by deliberation. And the best example I can give of this is parenting. Right? If a parent is constantly showering love on a child without any restraint, without any boundaries, no limits. This is the example I love to give because I saw it when I was a kid and I never forgot it. My mom had a first cousin of blessed memory, and we were all together as a family in St. Louis, and my mom's first cousin. So my second cousin was maybe 5-6 years old and was doing something that shouldn't be doing, playing with something on a table, something fragile, something expensive that could be broken, and was playing with it, and it would look dangerous. My mom said, no, you can't touch that. And my mom's first cousin said, don't ever tell my child no. And I was taken aback because I'd never heard somebody talk to my mom that way. Now, do we think that's good parenting? To never tell your child no? That was chesed unbalanced by givurah, by restraint, by judgment, by power. And I'm sure we've seen or heard about people who never hear no, how their personality might turn out. I think they have a difficult time functioning in life if they've never experienced a boundary or a no. So that's why in the Hasidic world, and we'll talk about Hasidism a little bit later, they see these Sphero really all about us. It's all about us, our personality. It's also about God's personality, but the practical side, when we talk about making this apply to your life, I think balancing chesed and givurah is one of the most practical things we can do as parents, as friends, as co-workers, as a leader, you know, in any relationship. If we're not balancing our love with a sense of judgment or restraint or boundary, those relationships are going to go awry. And as Philip is saying very nicely, maybe it's also a balance of the rational and emotional. I love it. It's balancing the heart and the mind. Absolutely. Great way to think of that, Philip. And like Musar, exactly.
Yeah.
This sense of balance, this sense of harmony is so important to Kabbalah. When things are out of balance within God and on us, things aren't going to go well in this world. And the Kabbalists will go so far, and this is again how they are so radical. They say when we act out of balance in our lives, it affects God's balance within God's self. As above, so below. When God is out of balance, this world is out of balance. When we're out of balance, we affect God, and God is out of balance. And God's flow of blessing into the world is not going to be harmonious. And we saw this when we celebrated Tu B'Shvat Seder, which was created by the Kabbalists in Sfat in Israel in the 1500s. that if we eat certain foods at Tu B'Shvat and say the blessing with the right mind and heart and focus and combining the Sphero and thinking of the Sphero, we're going to bring God's blessing of produce and bounty into the world. We saw this when we talk about Tu B'Shvat Seder. How can God get out of balance? Oh, work-life balance. Wonderful. Yeah. Even being able to say no so that we don't overwhelm ourselves. Yeah. Saying no to say yes to something else. Absolutely. Work-life balance. How can God be out of balance? Asked Nancy. So here's what's really radical about this system. I'm going to go back. I'm going to share the screen again. I'm going to share the screen. We're going to look at the Sphero again. So the same way that chesed can't be out of balance, it needs to be balanced by givurah, restraint, power, boundary. If there's too much givurah, too much powers, too much judgment, think of red. What emotion do we experience when we talk about being red with an emotion? All right, I'm going to bring up my chat again. Anger. To be red with anger, we are out of balance. We have let our sense of power and judgment, maybe judging people too harshly, without love, without kindness, without grace. That's how we get into trouble. And that's, according to the Kabbalists, that's why there's evil in this world. There is evil in this world because God is out of balance and givurah has overtaken chesed. So evil is born in givurah. Too much givurah, that is the source of evil. Within God, within the world, within ourselves. Does this seem practical? I think this seems very psychologically practical. But with some help, we can regulate each other's behavior. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Mike's saying very practical. Yeah. And by the way, the balance now between chesed and givurah, this is the first time we're seeing a Sphero that's based on balance. Look how the lines go, by the way. By the way, when you look at the lines, you'll see everything connects to everything else. I'm no mathematician. I haven't counted these lines, but everything's connected to everything else. So again, this is that mystical idea that all is interconnected, right? Everything is connected to everything else. Unity. But now for the first time, we're seeing in the system that chesed and givurah produce tiferet. So again, if we think of, again, male and female energies, yin and yang, they are producing imbalanced tiferet. And tiferet literally means beauty. Another name for tiferet is rachamim, compassion. Right? Love and power and judgment creating compassion. So tiferet is the balance of love and power. And Elizabeth, I'm just looking at your note. I think this is applicable to many things, but I don't know that it's immediately practical. Well, yeah, there we go. Heart. Okay. Oh, very nice. Heart. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so let me give you an example of making it practical. For people who may not always assert their own needs, sometimes too much gevurah is considered to be selfishness, but for people who don't assert their needs, don't speak up for themselves, you might say to them, or if it's you, you might think to yourself, I need to, tap into my gevurah, I need to tap into my power. I need to tap into my judgment. If I'm just, oh, whatever, then I'm not exercising, we're not exercising our own power and our own judgment. So that sense of boundary is something we could say, hey, I need to express more givurah in this moment, in this relationship, or I need to express more chesed. I need to express more love. Here's the other thing where parents can go wrong. The opposite of yes, 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 whatever, whatever, my dear. It's no, 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 no. Overly critical. To be overly critical of a child, to be overly critical of a coworker, to be overly critical of a friend. Too much givurah, too much judgment. It needs to be balanced by love. Where's the love? Where's the chesed? If we find ourselves focused too much and on one side. So yeah, I think the idea is, how do we make this practical? I think certainly relationships are the first place to start, and try to apply this to relationships. How can I create more love in this relationship, more grace, more yes, and how can I create more judgment, more power, more assertiveness, more boundary in this relationship? That's going to be givurah. And then trying to achieve that balance, if things are in balance, so it's tiferet, it's a sense of beauty, it's a sense of compassion. Now, here's what's neat too. So remember we said Chokhmah and Bina were the divine parents, and they're giving birth to Chesed and Gevurah. Tiferet and balance is the son of Chokhmah and Bina. And the word in the rabbinical tradition in the Talmud, one of the favorite words for God is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Blessed Holy One. So Tiferet is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Blessed Holy One, the main name for God, according to the Talmud. That is Tiferet, the son of Chokhmah and Bina. And then you also have other nature imagery, heaven, the heavens, the sky, the sun, a sense of harmony, sense of balance, kingship. The color is green. I love this. For those of you who like green, if you like me and you like green, I love it how they're saying green is the balance, the harmony between chesed and gevurah. By the way, the Kabbalists also in the Zohar, they see Jewish, forgive me, it's Jewish men, not Jewish women, back to the comment that was made earlier. Jewish biblical figures personify these attributes. It begins with chesed. Who was the paragon of loving kindness in the Torah? Who's the paragon of generosity and love? And somebody want to put that in the chat box? Who opened their tents on all four sides and welcomed in strangers and were willing to offer their most beloved child to God? Abraham. Abraham is the paragon of chesed. Isaac, the one who was willing to offer himself on the altar. The other side, the opposite. God's power, God's judgment. God says to do this. And Isaac acquiesced. He was receptive to that. Isaac's gevurah. Interestingly enough, the balance with Abraham, Isaac, Tiferet is Jacob. Now, if you look at the character of Jacob in the Bible, he's anything but balanced or harmonious. He's got a lot of conflict within him. But our tradition, this is an idealized form of Jacob. It does say that Jacob was Tom, and Tom was like perfect. Tom, it means simple, but also means perfect. So that the idealized form of Jacob Yisrael is Tiferet, is in balance, more idealized form. Okay, that all makes sense? We good so far? Because I really want to move to Netzach and Hod, because there's not a lot here, but Art Green does great stuff with Netzach and Hod. I think you guys are going to love it, and you're going to see how this applies to our lives, maybe even more so. So Netzach, so we're going down the body. So we've got the right arm, we've got the left arm of God and of ourselves. We've got the trunk, the torso in balance, our torso and Tiferet. Now we're moving down the legs. Netzach is the right leg. Netzach means eternity. It also means endurance, victory, and triumph. eternity, endurance, victory, triumph. And that's the right leg of God, and spiritually our right leg. And then the left leg is Hod, which means splendor, but Hod also could mean Hodaya, thanksgiving. So let's talk about Netzach and Hod together. And now I turn to Art Green in Ehiyeh, his book Ehiyeh, a Kabbalah for Tomorrow. I'm going to quote him because he is so great with Netzach and Hod. Let me find Netzach and Hod. Where did you go? Oh, so Teferetz. So if everything's harmonious, if everything's in balance so far, one may feel I can do anything. I'm in balance. I can do anything. Nothing can stop me. I'm Tom Brady. Forgive me for using a sports metaphor right now, but unstoppable. We could think of Netzach that way. And I'm going to quote Art Green now. Tiferet gives ride to Netzach or triumph. The Netzach in our personality celebrates our victory and believes that we can be triumphant over all enemies of perfection. Remember, Tom, perfect. The Hebrew word Tom means simple, but it also means perfect. We could be enemies or we can be triumphant over all enemies of perfection, whatever they may be. An inner sense of perfect balance can lead to the danger of triumphalism. I've won a great battle. I can do it all. Nothing will stand in my way. The Netzach within us calls forth a new opposing force called Hod, meaning beauty, but sometimes Hodaya, which means both gratitude, confession, admission. Netzach seeks to remake the world, transform the world, to render everything perfect. Hod is the admission we cannot do it all. The acknowledgement that we have to accept ourselves as we are and be grateful for life as it has been given to us. Netzach strives for transformation. Hod is the other side of wisdom, submitting to reality, rejoicing in what is, acceptance. So Netzach is transformation. We can transform anything. We can change anything we want. Hod balances it by saying, nope, some things you can't. You're not going to achieve perfection that way. You may not even achieve perfection. You need to accept certain things. Remember how I spoke for the High Holy Days, the Reinhold Niebuhr prayer, the Serenity Prayer. May I have the courage to accept what I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Change and acceptance are two polarities. Change and acceptance are two polarities of our lives. And if it's out of balance, too much acceptance is probably resignation. Too much, I can do it, I can transform the world, is going to probably lead to some heartache, and is probably exhausting for everybody around, somebody who thinks that everything needs to be changed. So it's the balance, Netzach and Hod, the balance between transformation and acceptance and gratitude for what is now in the middle with Yesod. That is the balance between Netzach and Hod, Yesod, which literally means foundation. It's sometimes called Tzaddik, the righteous one. So let's go back to personalities. Moses, right? Moses is going to transform the Israelite experience, free the slaves, receive the Torah, transform the Jewish people and society. We need Netzach. We need that sense of what can be. That's Moses. His brother Aaron is the priest. The priest is the one who can accept things as they are, be grateful for the majesty and the wonder of how things might be as it is. So you've got Moses, then you have Aaron on the left for Hod. Yesod, the righteous one, is Joseph, Jacob's son. So Jacob's right here at Tiferet. And here's his son, Joseph, at Yesod, the righteous one. And it's also sometimes described as covenant. And I'm talking about this HBO imagery and the sexual imagery. Yesod is the phallic symbol, the generative organ, the male generative organ. All of these divine energies are going to flow into the genital area for Yesod, the male area, and then through the act, this sexual energy, through this divine sexual act with the male and the female being Shekhinah, which is going to receive all this energy from Yesod, from the phallic symbol. That's going to bring all this blessing into the world. And this is where the created world comes from, through and Tiferet is the male, is the bride within God. Shekhinah Tiferet is the groom. Shekhinah is the bride. When we say Lecha Dodi, come to greet the bride, the presence of Shabbat, we're talking about Shabbat as, sort of this female counterpart to the Jewish people, the bride of the Jewish people that we celebrate, Shabbat that we celebrate, but also within the Kabbalistic system, Tiferet is the groom, Shekhinah is the bride. Through Tiferet's Yesod, going to impregnate the bride, and that's going to create the world. And that is going to create God's presence in the world. So let me talk about that for a second, and then I want to give us a chance to ask questions and comment. Shekhinah is a name in the Talmud for the indwelling presence of God. And you can see Shekhinah, you can see different names for it: earth, moon, queen, apple orchard, rainbow, these nature images, kingdom. Malchut means kingdom, communing with Israel, that sense of Israel's bride. Shekhinah is taken from a Talmudic idea of the God's immanence into being the female, the fully developed female side of God. And we see here, we've got sort of male and female imagery as we go down. Chokhmah, Bina. Well, I guess that's the main one. We've got Chokhmah and Bina. We've got the polarities of right and left being balanced by the center. It really is with Shekhinah that this feminine aspect of God, this feminine divine energy, comes to full fruition. And what the Kabbalists do is they really help to create sort of the feminine aspect of God through Shekhinah. God is mother. It's up in Bina, the main form of mother down here that creates everything, Bina at the top. But then Shekhinah, everything is going to flow into this world and into God's female aspect of Shekhinah. And Shekhinah is where we meet God. Shekhinah is where we meet God at Sinai. Shekhinah is where, God, the creator of the world, that's Shekhinah. God as the revealer of God's wisdom, that's Shekhinah. God as redeemer of the world, that's Shekhinah as well. Okay, so Shekhinah is one of the most powerful concepts in this very powerful radical system. So Jeff Ring asked a question for the month of Adar, which we're supposed to start being joyful. We've just entered the month of Adar today, actually, and so we're supposed to start being joyful. Where in the Sphero do we find joy, happiness, and delight? That is a great question. And where would you say, Jeff, given what we've studied so far, where would you say joy is right now? You can't find it. Okay. How about this? Let's go back to the imagery of a parent, of a mother giving birth. Is there anything, is there no joy greater, even though there's a little bit of pain involved, and maybe a lot of pain involved, is there no joy greater than a mother giving birth to a child? That's Bina. So I think we could say there's joy in Bina. I think we can say there's joy in Shekhinah. Remember, if we're saying that Shekhinah is really that aspect of God. So again, it's all one, everything's connected. So I'm not trying to separate, I'm saying it's only Shekhinah that creates the world. All of this finds fulfillment in Shekhinah. So all of this helps to create the world. But it all flows through Shekhinah. When it says in the Torah that God looked at everything God made and found it good, tov, good, tov ma'od, very good. We can say there's joy in Shekhinah, again, in this female presence, this female aspect. I think there's joy in Chesed. I think there's joy in this love. So I think we might find joy in a number of these, I would look to Bina. I would look to joy in being balanced into Tiferet. I would look for joy in Chesed. I would look for it in Shekhinah. But that's a great question you're asking, Jeff. And again, back to the practical. So let me give some more emotions that we can maybe can apply to this Sephirotic system. Keter again is will, right? We have a sense of will. We have a desire to do things. So our sense of will, we can find in Keter. I'm looking at a thinker, who finds selflessness in Chokhmah. So a sense of altruism or selflessness, but then again, I think you find that in Chesed too. Obviously love in Chesed, which means loving kindness. Fear in Givurah. We didn't talk about fear, but again, talking about evil, talking about too much judgment, talking about too much anger. Scratch the surface of anger, I bet we find some fear. So we've got fear in Givurah. We've got compassion, as it says in Tiferet, Rachamim, mercy, compassion. In Tiferet, confidence in Netzach. I can do anything, I can transform anything. We got confidence. Hod, a sense of thanksgiving, a sense of gratitude, maybe humility, sincerity. Yesod is sometimes called emet, truth. To be honest, to be truthful is Yesod. So yeah, anger comes from fear. Yeah. And then Malchut, also a sense of humility, a sense of, it's the lowest Sphera, so a sense of humbleness, but in a good way. Humbleness, earthiness, All right, so let me stop the share. Before I stop the share, I just want to refer you to the second, diagram, which is Art Green's just showing you the flow of how things come. If you're forgetting, well, what creates what and what's the linear flow of this, he shows you the flow of things here. But he's also talking about God's holiest name, Yod He Vav He. We'll talk about that later. In one of our other classes. But then if you look at this last page that I've given you on the handout, this is Art Green's version of the way to describe the different Sphero and the different connections to the Sphero. Now there's overlap between what Daniel Matt does too. You're going to see overlap here, and they're going to name the patriarchs. But you're going to see some overlap. You're going to see some more nature imagery, some metaphor. So take a look. I would, after tonight, take a look at both of these or all three of these diagrams to get a better sense of how the Sphero connect to one another and what they mean. The talk of the Sphero is the main topic of conversation in the Zohar. So 1,000 pages, we're not going to understand it all in an hour and a half, but I hope I've given you some outline of how to understand the different Sphirot, and we'll continue to talk about them for the next 2 sessions together. But I'd like to now open it up to questions or comments. Bye, Elizabeth. Thank you. Any questions? Maybe why don't we start with any questions about the Spherotic system and what all this means, or what?
Rabbi, in the chat, did you put the names of the couple books that you highly recommend?
Yeah, let me do that. So, oh, you know what, Harley, you've got it on, I listed on the diagram.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, so look where I say where the diagram comes from. I list those 2 books, and I even tell you the publisher and the year.
Yeah,
it was published.
got it. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, good question. Okay, other questions, comments?
Relate the Zohar to the to Kabbalah, meaning is it as sometimes we look at a compilation of all of the thoughts? I don't know.
Right. Well, so it is believed that the Zohar was written by one person or a school of Kabbalists in Spain. The name given is Moshe de Leon. He was the first person in 1280 who said, hey, I discovered this sacred text written by Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a 2nd century Talmudic sage. And I've discovered this text. It's got this incredible wisdom about God and us and the world. And scholars say he wrote it. It's his creation. And maybe a school of Kabbalists, maybe he studied with other Kabbalists and maybe shared his writing, and they say, oh, this is good stuff, you know, what else you got? So, but Zohar, I think, stands on its own as far as a composition. The Sefer Yetzirah from the 3rd to 6th century was like the first Jewish text that we know of that mentions the Sphirot and as these numbers and powers. And then Sefer Yetzirah also stands on its own, more developing the Sephirotic system. But you can see the Zohar builds on those 2 texts that came before it. Okay. And all Kabbalah builds on everything else because, again, it's receiving this tradition and building upon it. So, but when you think about the Zohar, that is considered like the main text. If you really want to study Kabbalah, you know, the Zohar is the place to go. It's been developed since then, but it's almost like if you really want to know Jewish practice, it's the Talmud. The Torah is important. The Bible is extremely important. They came before Talmud, but Talmud is the user guide for Jewish life, even to this day. The same way Zohar is the user guide to Kabbalah.
Kabbalah. Okay, yeah, that's absolutely perfect.
But again, when we think of the word Kabbalah, just think Jewish mystical tradition. Kabbalah, Jewish mystical tradition. And Zohar, the primary text of the Jewish mystical tradition.
Wasn't there a conflict between Rabbinic Judaism and mysticism? Because Rabbinic Judaism wants us to understand what God wants us to do rather than speculate the nature of God.
Mike, great point. And Mike, what you're bringing up is a way that Kabbalah was, with these radical images, the feminine aspects of God, the sexual and energy within God, that, you know, that we have the power to, by our actions, by the way, so like, let me connect it, Mike, and this is great. By human beings doing mitzvot, that stimulates Yesod, and you can see where I'm going with this. Our actions stimulate the divine phallus for Tiferet and Shekhinah to come together. Mitzvot do that. Now, God also can do it as well, but our mitzvot stimulate God to come in balance and to bring this divine flow and blessing into the world. So they're not rejecting Torah. It's the Zohar is a commentary on the Torah. They're talking about biblical figures. They're talking about Talmudic figures like Shimon Bar Yochai. They are grounding all these radical ideas in very normative, traditional Judaism. That's how they could get away with it.
It reminds me of, there was a hint, I guess, in the Hindu Reformation where the Hindu priest claimed that if you conducted the sacrifice ceremony perfectly, you could compel the gods to do exactly as you wished. And there's the hint here that by doing these things in a certain way, you can alter the ineffable one.
Yeah, and you do find this in other traditions. It's called theurgy, theurgic, to influence God, that our actions influence God. And you do find it in a number of religious traditions and a lot of mystical traditions. So think about too, and here's the amazing thing that I just want to share, and I know we're getting close, but there's just so much rich material here. Picture the Jewish world. Picture a Jewish world that doesn't have a lot of power, that is at the mercy of other faiths and other people who are in power. And they are saying, you've got the power, Jews. When you do the mitzvot, you may not have the political power, but you have the spiritual power to transform God's self and transform this world. That is incredibly empowering to people who may not have political power.
I'm reading a book called Ornament of the World about Muslim Spain. And it was right around then in the 13th century when the fundamentalist Muslims took over and really shut down Jewish life in Spain, to be followed by the Christians who did the same. So there'd been like maybe 500 years of grace, and then everything was falling apart. So maybe that echoes that spirit you're talking about.
Yeah, in the sense of not being in balance, and yeah, absolutely. And remember too, the Jewish approach to studying this mysticism, you have to be grounded in Torah and Tanakh and Bible and Talmud before you can even touch this stuff. You know, when Kabbalah became very popular in the 90s with folks like, you know, Madonna and Ashton Kutcher, and they were going to the Kabbalah Center on Pico and Robertson area, you know, a Kabbalist would say, you can't do this outside of not being grounded in Torah and Bible and Talmud. That's not the way it works. And then the idea that you have to be married and you have to, you know, be 40 years old, meaning you have some life experience. They were trying to put some guardrails on this esoteric thinking so people wouldn't lose their minds or go off the deep end thinking that they knew some mysterious knowledge that nobody else had, and they weren't grounded in reality. So a number of major Kabbalists were also, you know, great Talmudic thinkers. And I mean, when I say Talmudic thinkers, I mean, they knew Talmud, they commentated on the Talmud after it was written. You've got one of the most conservative, when I say conservative, but one of the most respected traditional Jews, Joseph Caro, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, you know, the Ashkenazic guide to how do you live a Jewish life. He was a Kabbalist. He did meditations and he did automatic writing. He believed, you know, he would meditate on a verse like a mantra, and he would believe that this divine being or an angel would give him insights and wisdom. And nobody was more traditional or normative than Joseph Caro. I mean, in the sense that the Shulchan Aruch is like the most traditional thing you can think of. So it's not mutually exclusive, but you need the foundation in order to really study this and practice this.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
thank you. I need to go, but I want to thank you. This is really interesting. I'm looking forward to the other sessions.
Well, great. Okay, thank you, Harley. And now probably is a good time. It's 9 o'clock, everybody. So again, we're going to be meeting next Wednesday, same time, same place, 7:30 to 9. and I'll have some more handouts for you. Please look over, the handouts tonight. And if you have any more questions or comments, great being with y'all.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Have a
Thanks.
good week. You're most
Thank you.
welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Rabbi.
You are most
Thank you.
welcome.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.